Good evening, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde and kia ora koto. I hope I pronounced that right. My name is Christine Nakamura, Vice President of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada in the Toronto office. Welcome to the pre-mission learning session for delegates of the first Canadian women-only business mission to Australia and New Zealand. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that while we are all meeting in a global digital space, the places Canadians call home are the traditional territories of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Tonight, our team is joining you from Toronto on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I'd like to begin by once again congratulating all of you, all of our delegates. We received an unexpectedly large volume of applications for this particular mission, which is the fourth in our series of women business missions to the Asia Pacific region. So you should be exceptionally proud of yourselves for being part of this cohort of talented women entrepreneurs. The agenda for our two-day mission is now finalized, and I believe Nadine from our team will be sharing it with you shortly. We have a great program confirmed with high-level messages from the Governor General of Canada, who is an Indigenous person, the Prime Minister of Canada, and our Minister of International Trade, Export Promotion, Small Business, and Economic Development, who are all very supportive of our Women's Business Mission series. And we have two powerhouse panels of women leaders, including Indigenous women in business from Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, who will share their journeys and provide tips on how to succeed in growing your businesses. And I believe we have received your video company pitches, which will be featured on day 2 of the mission to an audience of interested businesses and potential partners in the region. Our team is really pumped and very excited to host next week, and hope you are too. Tonight, we have prepared quite an extensive, intensive program over the next 90 minutes for you, with experts and senior officials and representatives of the diplomatic missions here in Canada, as well as Export Development Canada, and a special guest from one of the law firms, Jessica Horowitz, who have a deep understanding of target markets and know-how, and will provide insightful advice on our mission sectors of infrastructure, smart cities, sustainable solutions, and healthcare technologies. We have also arranged for an overview of government supports available to you with our senior representatives of government, and including Export Development Canada, which is a Crown agency. And we will introduce to you APF Canada's Canadian Women's International Network, or CanWIN, to which we intend to onboard all of you. In the interest of time, we'll blast through all the sessions and host a Q&A session for all the presentations at the end, and I hope that you'll agree to that. We ask everyone to remain on mute unless you are speaking, and I thank you in advance for your cooperation. So with no further ado, we'll begin with a fireside chat with Mr. Matt Ritchie, Consul General and Trade Commissioner at the New Zealand Trade and Enterprise in Vancouver, and Michelle McConwell, Investment Director at Austrade office here in Toronto. You've received the bios of all of our speakers for tonight, so please refer to them so that we don't have to use up the valuable time that we have for the speakers tonight. So Matt and Michelle will each give a brief introduction to an overview of the markets and business culture, followed by a brief discussion afterwards. So Matt, can we start with you on New Zealand?
Yeah, no mai, haere mai, kia ora, everybody. Great to see, very large turnout and excited people for next week. So New Zealand business culture. When I was thinking about what I would say to you last week, it came down to we've got the Western business culture, and then we've got Maori business culture, and I'll touch on both, I think, very briefly, because we don't have a lot of time. But on the Western business culture side of things, New Zealand businesses are very, very similar to Canadian businesses, to Australian businesses. The maybe slight differences in New Zealand businesses will tend to be smaller and therefore maybe a little bit more laid back and relaxed in meetings and things like that. So not as formal as you might be used to. And there'll be a lot of talk about sport and talk about your families and more personal lifestyle type conversations before you get into the business. So I don't know if I really want to spend too much time on that, but on the Maori business side, it's much more interesting and probably a little bit more different to what you're used to. And it's probably, if you were meeting a Maori business in person, it can be a little bit confronting sometimes if you're not expecting some of the customary things that happen. A Maori business meeting can be quite formal if it's the first meeting, and not a lot of business will be talked about in that first meeting. It's about getting to know you as a person, where your family's from, and there is a fairly set way that it's usually done through what we call a mihi mihi. And while you won't be expected to have a mihi mihi, most New Zealanders and New Zealand business people, we learn it at school. We and businesses learn their own mihi mihis, and it's basically in the Maori language. You explain where you are from, where your ancestors are from, a little bit about your family, and then lastly, you name yourself and who you are. And once you do that, and the other person does that, or the other people in the meeting, then you can probably get down to maybe a cup of tea or a coffee and some food, and then you get down to business, and then it becomes very informal. So very formal to informal. Yeah, just in the interest of time, I'll probably pause there. The only other comment sort of around the environment at the moment I'd like to make is the Auckland region is still in lockdown. So when you are meeting the businesses from the Auckland region next week, they are suffering because it's quite a severe lockdown. So only essential businesses are open. There are no restaurants. I think you're allowed takeaways and things like that. But it's pretty tough going there, and the Waikato region is just out of lockdown. So in recovery mode. The rest of the New Zealand, so the South Island and the Lower North Island, have been operating reasonably in a normal capacity over the last while. But New Zealand has kind of suffered the pandemic at the tail end of how we're facing the pandemic here in Canada, is how I would say. So I think, unless there's any, I'm happy to answer questions and things, but I might as well pass it over.
Okay, then I think we'll go straight into the next presentation, and we'll do the questions at the end. So Michelle, over to you.
Thanks, Christine. It's an honor to participate. I didn't realize this was the first virtual women delegation to Australia and New Zealand, so I really appreciate being part of it. Look, right off the bat, I'm going to state the obvious. I don't have an Australian accent. I am Canadian, but I've been fortunate to work in both Canada and Australia, and with Canadians and Australians in my current role. So I feel uniquely positioned to speak on the topic and share my experiences. Look, I prepared some slides for the discussion, and I'm having difficulty sharing them. So you can send them after, or I can speak to them here. I know, Nadine, you might be able to share them yourself, but we'll jump right in. Look, I'll share with you some tips about the Australian business culture, including Indigenous business culture, And then I thought I might speak as well to the CPTPP agreement, because it appears like a lot of the attendees are able to export products or services. And before that, I'll share a little bit about my organization so that you can know how we can assist you with your business journey. Nadine, if you want to flip to the next slide, it's got some info about Austrade. Thank you. So I work for the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, or Austrade for short, because that's rather a mouthful. We deliver services to help facilitate potential for an investment in Australia. And foreign investment can take many forms. So it's really any activity that creates jobs and has an economic impact, such as establishing a regional headquarters or conducting R&D or setting up a manufacturing facility. And our complementary services can be summed up by what I call the 3 C's. So we coordinate, we connect, and we create opportunities. And it involves everything from your initial coordination of investment inquiries. We can provide information on the Australian business and regulatory environment. We share market intelligence and specific investment opportunities. We can provide advice on government programs, approval processes, and so much more. So if I can be of assistance, please don't hesitate to reach out. And I think Christine and AW can share my contact following the pre-brief. So in terms of business culture, Nadine, I'll ask you to flip to the next slide. Thanks. So just for my own experiences, I've pulled out my top 3. I think we're aware that, Canadians and Australians are known to be quite similar. We have similar colonial roots, similar primary languages spoken. The majority of our populations are centered around our borders. We have similar strength and resources in energy sectors and so many more, but there are obviously these key differences that I want to raise your awareness of. So first, in terms of communication, Australians are known for abbreviating words and using a lot of informal phrases. So I was reflecting on my own experiences, and I remember the first time I sat down at a team meeting and someone asked me if I wanted a chalky bicky. And I had no idea what they were talking about. It's a chocolate biscuit, for those of you who don't know. There are plenty of others. You've probably heard the short form of Australian, which is Aussie. You may not be familiar of other words such as arvo for afternoon or convo for conversation. I've also observed that Australians are very fond of acronyms. So when you're in a business context, please feel free to ask for clarification on something. It isn't considered rude, and it can often strengthen that business relationship because you'll likely have a laugh about it. And Australians have a really good sense of humor. In comparison to Canadians, their sense of humor is sarcastic, and they can often use teasing. And they tease people who are particularly successful or are seen to have achieved a high status. And people will often tease others who are their superiors. So teasing is often perceived to be a way of making people feel comfortable with their position. And it's really based on this underlying Australian assumption that everyone likes to be treated equal. So it's something to keep in mind. Second, and I'm not sure if you've heard of it before, but it's tall poppy syndrome. So if you imagine a poppy in a garden, it's a really tall, slender plant that, grows above the others. And so this concept of tall poppy syndrome describes Australians' negative attitudes towards people in positions of authority or power. And so they compare them to tall poppies. And sometimes they can cut them down as a result of, standing out from the crowd. So even Australians who are very successful sometimes downplay their achievements to ensure that they're accepted by others. And even managers rarely emphasize their authority. They prefer to appear equal to subordinates. And so it all goes back to that Australian core value of equality. And I think it's something important to keep in mind as you promote, yourself, your business, your product. It's a good idea to celebrate your success, but while keeping in mind this business culture. And then, connecting back to my previous point, if you get in an uncomfortable situation or it, that comes up, you can use humor to diffuse the situation. And then, finally, I'll talk about meeting style, because of course you're going to be preparing to meet with Australians in this business context. And I think it's helpful to understand that flow. It can be similar to Canada, but there are slight differences. So at the beginning of the meeting, and kind of in contrast actually to what Matt was discussing, the start of the meeting is more informal. So these informalities and introductions are exchanged over a cup of tea or coffee, and informal topics such as weather, sports, or weekend activities are discussed. And then you slowly get into business. So you start discussing general business. And then Australians tend to enter into more direct and frank discussions, which was surprising to me the first few times. I find the culture to be a bit more blunt around topics that can be sensitive, such as financial or political. So that's one key difference to keep in mind. And then that direct discussion can often be followed by some humor, maybe some more frank discussion, and then it ends off very friendly, very informally, just like your friends or mates, as Australians would often use. And then Nadine, I'll maybe get you to flip to the next slide. Thanks. So I would be remiss if I didn't speak about Indigenous business culture in Australia. And I wanted to highlight two aspects in particular that are closely related to meeting flow. First, and as we would do in Canada, and as Christine just did, it's good practice to begin the meeting by acknowledging the culture or territory, the country or territory where the meeting is taking place. It's also important to establish trust and relationship at the start of the business meeting and the relationship, much like what Matt referenced when he was talking about the Maori culture. So when you think about the meeting flow that I just talked, this part of the meeting might take a bit longer to ensure that you've established that trust and honesty before embarking on that more transactional part of the discussion. And then something to note as you undertake business and partnerships, Australia has an Indigenous procurement policy, or IPP, and the purpose is to stimulate Indigenous entrepreneurship, business and economic development, providing Indigenous Australians with more opportunities to participate in the economy. And so in order to achieve success, annual targets are set for the volume and value of contracts that are awarded to Indigenous enterprises. And there are other measures and policies to ensure that Indigenous businesses are given opportunities. So if you're interested in learning more, I would be happy to connect you to our Consul General, Josh Riley. Josh organized the largest Indigenous business delegation to Canada in 2019. He's very knowledgeable on the topic. And then Nadine, I'll get you to flip to the last slide. So something to keep in mind as you consider doing business with both Australia and New Zealand is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP for short. Through CPTPP, Canada now has access to 500 million consumers, which is massive. It was signed in 2019. It's in force with numerous countries, but Australia, Canada, and New Zealand are some of those signatories. And the CPTPP, just high level, establishes duty-free access for trade and goods between Canada and Australia and those other countries. And it eliminates tariffs for key Canadian exports, including everything from agriculture, forestry, chemicals, metals and minerals, just to name a few. And I know that you're all interested in exporting your products and services. So I thought you might be interested to know what our top 3 exports are from Canada to Australia. Interestingly enough, the first 2 are services. So travel service and commercial service are the top 2. And commercial service, just in case you're interested, is made up of professional, scientific, and technical services. And then finally, industrial machinery rounds out the top 3. And that's it. Thank you. I'll hand it back to Christine.
Thank you very much, Michelle. That was great. I think we have a couple of minutes. I think we'll just ask one question and leave the rest for the after all the presentations. So this is a very general question, but probably after the 2 presentations might be helpful, and both of you can pipe in very briefly. generally outsiders kind of think of Australia and New Zealand as being culturally very similar. But obviously, from a bit of the presentations, there are differences between the two countries. And I'd like to know, and I think the entrepreneurs would like to know, what ways are the two countries' business cultures, norms, and expectations similar or different? And can we start with you, Matt?
Yeah, sure. The analogy I like to give is when someone, say a New Zealander, for example, confuses a Canadian as an American. It's exactly the same, right? Like so yeah, either New Zealanders especially. I can't speak for the Australians, obviously, but if it's assumed that we're Australian, there is it's not a big it's not a big offence, but there is a offence taken. Michelle mentioned the shortening of words. We don't tend to do that in New Zealand, so that is one thing that, yes, we do have abbreviations, but not to the same extent as the Aussies. I struggle like in the business because I haven't had a lot to do with Australian businesses. I've my experiences in Asia, Europe, and North America, so I can't really say from my experience what the differences would be. But my guess would be more not as laid back as New Zealand businesses, and that concept of being very frank. I can't imagine a New Zealand business doing that to the same extent as an Australian.
Okay.
But I'd defer to Michelle.
Okay, Michelle, do you want to pipe in here with a couple of comments?
Sure. I think because Matt focused on the differences, I can maybe highlight some similarities.
Yeah.
Matt, I think that's really interesting about the abbreviation of words, because I didn't know that. I wondered if maybe it was similar in New Zealand. So I have had limited business dealings with Australians and can I say Kiwis? Is that Matt? Okay.
Aussies and Kiwis.
Okay. And so I find, if you're looking for like a common point to discuss, sports always seems to be popular. I don't know what it is, but we all love sports. And so that's a great conversation starter. And I think we have this similar sense of camaraderie, this instant relationship with each other, especially when we're overseas. We really seem to bond. Here in Toronto, we have a couple of Australian and Kiwi owned businesses, and it attracts, everyone from all those countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and we really hit it off, and, informal networking and things like that take place there. So just a couple of similarities that I've observed in the market.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much for those frank comments. So for the rest of the questions to both Matt and Michelle, we'll take it to the end and at the Q&A. And I apologize that we are under really tight time frames tonight, but I hope that these comments were helpful to you. And so now I'd like to call upon Sarah Quigley, our Canadian Senior Trade Commissioner from our Canadian Consulate in Sydney, Australia, to give a brief overview of the markets in both Australia and New Zealand through a Canadian lens and the opportunities in the sectors for our mission. We also have, excuse me, Maria Lowe, Senior Trade Commissioner from the Canadian Consulate in Auckland. She's also with us today and will be able to help in Q&A at the end of the session. So Sarah, with no further ado, over to you.
Thanks kindly, Christine. And if I may jump on one last point to Michelle and Matt, is that my experience, and I'm married to a Kiwi and living in Australia, so I feel like I spend a lot of time in both countries. I feel like there's a greater British legacy in New Zealand. It's a little bit more akin to Canadian sort of level of constant politeness, a reticence maybe to talk about finances with people you don't know, versus Australians very direct, less politically correct. It can come as a bit of a shock to Canadians how non-politically correct Australians are in not in a bad way. It's just sort of things sometimes we maybe Kiwis or Canucks think in our head and don't say, and it's like, well, okay, it's out there, great. So that's a bit of a shift. AW, are you able to throw up my presentation? Or Nadine? Thank you, kindly. Okay, we can flip a couple of slides to the first content. My lovely executive assistant has put beautiful color photographs on. Okay, so I'm not an economist and neither is Maria, but we just thought we'd give a brief overview, there, better sound, a brief overview of sort of the similarities between, I'll start with Canada and Australia, and I'll speak for both Maria and I now, and then we can ask questions to both later. Australia and Canada share a strong, sophisticated, developed economy. I just put these two side-by-side views so you can see just how similar we are, from everything to population and landmass to density, but also high standards of living, culture, language. Michelle talked about resource-driven economies. We both have very educated workforces, legal, political stability, and the like. Change slides if you can. And we did another one for New Zealand. It doesn't hit the mark in terms of exactly how similar we are because we have a large size difference. But that being said, you can just see the similarities in terms of soundness of banking's rate at the bottom of these charts. Global competitiveness, we're quite on par. Both New Zealand, all three, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. So next slide, please. And now to sort of, Michelle touched on it, but I'll just delve a little deeper into the trade and investment relationship. So Australia and Canada trade about $4.5 billion in bilateral trade. So that's goods and services, fairly equally distributed. And that's, as she referred to, mostly machinery, a lot of machinery, aircraft, vehicles, things like that, coming from Canadian exports to Australia. And then the reverse, Australians export to Canada a lot of wine, meat, and then some minerals such as ore. And then taking a look at the investment relationship, looks like really, really big numbers. We say 70 billion in bilateral or two-way investment. But the Aussies would say it's closer to 82 billion. I'm not sure why the difference in stats, but clearly economists calculating differently. But the vast majority of that is Canadian pension funds. So as Australians rapidly privatized their state-owned assets, it attracted significant investment from our pension funds, namely CPPIB and CDPQ. So that accounts for a lot of that. And, when you look at a stat like Australia receives over 40%, that's, you'd think, why wouldn't that be China? Or, why Australia? It's the pension funds. Go ahead. And, Canada, New Zealand trade relationship, I'm a little less familiar with this one, but $1.5 billion in bilateral trades, not equitably distributed, so many more goods going in than services, and around 2.7 billion in investment coming in, and some of that would be pension funds as well. I think pension funds are one of our largest investments into New Zealand, and Matt can confirm that for me after. But next slide, please. So look, Australia's had 3 decades of consecutive economic growth. It's a pretty powerful statement. Not a lot of economies can say that. Obviously, COVID stopped that in its tracks. But if we take a look at employment rates now, employment rates here I wouldn't say post-COVID, but as we move into the impact of COVID and recovering from it, it's improving immensely. Openness to global trade and investment, I won't go through them all, but I've highlighted CPTPP, which Michelle mentions as well, and I'll delve a little deeper into that one in a minute. But there's a sense that if you're doing business in Australia or you have an Australian partner, it really opens up a gateway of other elimination of tariffs through other FTAs that Australia has. So if you can go to the next slide. And I'll provide this presentation to AW when I'm done. So if anybody would like to be sent it, they're more than welcome to. Doing business in New Zealand, you'll see very similar. We've talked about rankings already in terms of soundness of business or World Bank rankings. They have a few further FTAs with countries, Pacer Plus included. But yeah, it's the same point as I made in the last slide. You know, you're getting access to other countries through doing business here. So next slide. Okay, challenges. This slide is a little bit lengthier. Obviously, the greatest challenge in doing business is distance. And tied to that distance, you'll see I've mentioned logistics. So shipping, supply chain, time difference. The weather conditions, we've put them in all in one slide, but I'd say drought, floods, and fire belong to us here in Australia, and earthquakes over to Matt for New Zealand. Well-established competition. So look, there's ready access to Asian and other low-cost producers in the region. That's a big factor you have to think about when you're thinking about exporting your good or service here. There's also a lot of domestic competition, so well-established domestic competition. And there's also programs. So Australia have a lot of programs to support local content. Which is not dissimilar to North America. You know, in the US, it's Buy America programs or Buy American, and similar. Canada has some similar at the, you know, mostly at the municipal and provincial level as well. Labor shortages. You'll hear any CEO today talk about global talent shortage and getting people to where they need to be. And then I put up taxes. Of course, there's tariffs, duties, shipping costs, but you know, when you're considering tariffs, it's really important to know if you have a good that you check your NAICS code so that you know, you have an idea of what free trade agreements can apply to you and how you could remove possibly tariffs or non-tariff barriers. So next slide, please. So CPTPP, Michelle touched upon it. It affects 500 million consumers worldwide and just over 13% of GDP. So that's a huge chunk of the market. It really improves our competitiveness as Canadians and for Canadian companies in these markets. It eliminates right now about 95% of all tariffs exporting to these markets. And over the course of the next 12, 13 years, it will eventually eliminate 99% of all tariffs. And I know a couple industries were mentioned, but I know some of the folks on the call are in the sort of agri-food space. So it's almost 95% of those tariffs would be removed. Seafood, it's 100%, forestry, 100%, etc. But if you want to know if that affects you, you know, reach out to us and we can work with you to let you know how that could or could not affect you. I would also mention non-tariff barriers. So one of the biggest ones that's come out of CPTPP is Canadian companies have access to government procurement opportunities here in Australia on a level that's you know, equal footing with domestic suppliers. So an important thing to note. Next slide, please. So that's it sort of for a macroeconomic view. And I'll just touch on, for the second half of my presentation here, the Trade Commissioner Service, which I represent here in Australia in our Sydney office. So we have about 1,000 trade commissioners across Canada. And we work in embassies, high commissioners, and consulates or consul generals. Here in Australia, we're represented in Canberra at the High Commission level. And then we have a consulate in Sydney. So there's probably about 5 trade commissioners in total, 4 to 5 working out of the Canberra office. And there's 9 of us here, trade commissioners or assistants in Sydney. One of those is actually locally based in Brisbane and covers oil, mining, and gas to be a little closer to the action. And we used to have a footprint in Melbourne as well, which was cut a few years back, but we go very often to Melbourne if you have business interests there as well. So we offer 4 main services: preparing for international markets, assess potential for international markets, finding vetted business contacts, and then solving problems. The first 2 services we offer are mainly done by our regional offices. We have multiple regional offices in most major economic centers in Canada. And a lot of you on the call will have already received an email. So when we learned about this mission, we gave a heads up to all the regional offices to expect all of you to be reaching out. So I hope they either contacted you or you contacted them at this point. And then what they do is after they've sort of qualified you as a contact, if you weren't a client, excuse me, if you weren't already a client of the TCS, then I've identified that you're looking for Australia, New Zealand as the market, they pass you off to us so that we can work with you directly in market. What we're looking for in qualifying as a client is simply that you have a commitment and a capacity to internationalization, that you're, in other words, exporting, and that you have meaningful economic ties in Canada, and that you're going to contribute to Canada's economic growth in doing so. It's not dissimilar from any other trade promotion agencies worldwide, but those are what we're looking for when we qualify you. And once we've qualified you, then, as I said, really, we're looking for you to be moved to the actual missions like Sydney, and then we're going to work with you to see what your individual needs are. Some of the assessment things we're doing with you is to provide you with intelligence. Should you be coming in here, an appreciation of the effort or resources it will take you to move into this market. Some of you are far beyond that and are ready to be, passed along to critical business contacts. Maybe it could be introductions to companies that you want to work with, or it could be a local chamber of commerce or a mentor who you need to sort of get established in the area. And then resolving business problems, that's a wide array of items that I capture in that one, but it could be connected to, let's say you have a regulatory issue that's preventing you from selling your product in here, and we advocate for you to local or state government, but it could be something like that. It could be something as simple as a logistics problem, or and connecting you to the right person. So it's pretty wide array. Next slide, please. This is just a quick slide I wanted to mention about sort of some of the things we're looking for you to have prepared and thought of prior to speaking with us, but will help you along the way. So when you're wondering if Australia or New Zealand are the right markets to sell into, is there a demand for your product? Have you established there would be, a decent return on your investment if you were to export here? Have you assessed your competition here in these markets? And have you taken a hard look at your challenges? I mentioned a bunch of the challenges before. It could be tariffs or logistics or HR, finance. Do you want a person on the ground? Do you want to partner with an Australian? Is that an easier way for you to get your business up and running? And then unique value proposition. So I mentioned there's competition from Asian markets, and there's domestic competition here in Australia and in New Zealand, and those are well established. So what's different about your product or service? And it really helps. We find really helpful in introducing you to other companies here that you have testimonials. So referrals that people can reach out to that have used your product or service. Next slide, please. Almost at the end here. So TCS, these are just some of, I won't go into them, but some of the funding and support programs we have. If you're a tech startup, we have mentorship and boot camp programs. If you belong to a group such as women or Indigenous businesses, then we have extra support and services geared towards those groups of business owners. And next slide, please. I'll talk about our flagship program, Can Export. Look, Can Export was created to increase employment and capacity for Canadian companies to get into new markets. It has a goal of increasing exports by 50% by 2025, if I'm not mistaken. The last few years, there's been around 33 million pumped annually into this program at a cost-sharing basis of 75-25. So basically, you put in a request for a certain dollar value, you'll get 75% of those funds. Right now, it's been lowered to 50-50 as we close out our fiscal year. But I'm hoping when they announce the program is up and fully running again next year, that it'll be at a 75-25 cost share. But even at a 50-50, it's good bang for your buck. And the only thing I'll say, because I can give lots more detail on CanExport separately to anybody who's interested, but it is an easy application process. It is not a long, convoluted, bureaucratic process. It's pretty straightforward. They just want to know if you qualify to request these funds, and then that you have a solid business plan of how you want to use these funds. It's destined for a new market. So they want you to have made sales of less than $100,000 or no more than 10% of your revenues in the last year. So that's what it's geared for, really you moving into a new market that you haven't been into before, or have maybe scratched the surface but haven't delved deeper. Next slide, please. And I'll just hand this out. This is just a list of all our trade commissioners in Australia. We go by sector. If you don't see your sector there, or you don't know how to define, based on that, there's 2 or 3 that fit, just drop me a line and I'll let you know who's responsible. We cover the whole country. So each officer that has a sector, they cover all of Australia. So it's not done, geographically or anything. You'll get one person, one contact for the whole country. And same with New Zealand, which I think is the next slide. A smaller team, but mighty and powerful ladies. They covered all of New Zealand with each of their sectors that they do. So the sectors listed, just to let you know, are sort of our main focus and our priority sectors, driven by exports, like what products are sort of capacities are complementary between the 2 countries. But we do cover sectors that aren't. If you don't see your sector there, don't worry, we can still assist. Next slide. That's just research resources, and I think that may bring us to the end. Hopefully I haven't gone too much over time.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Very short time, but quite comprehensive, and promise to distribute your presentation to everybody afterwards so that they can review what you had done. And it was a great presentation. Thank you very much. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Catherine Beach, National Lead of Women in Trade from Export Development Canada, or EDC, and her colleague Victoria Searle of the EDC's office in Sydney, to talk about the supports available to women entrepreneurs aspiring to export to international markets. So with no further ado, Catherine and Victoria, over to you.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. Just wanting to make sure everyone can see my screen here. I see some head nods. That's great. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting us to participate this evening or today, depending on where you are. I'm Catherine Beach, and I lead the Women in Trade strategy within the Inclusive Trade team at Export Development Canada. I'm speaking with you tonight from Ottawa on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, who we thank for sharing this land. I'm also joined by Victoria from our EDC Sydney office. So I'm going to cover a lot of ground tonight, and I also know we only have 10 minutes, so I'll try to be concise, but as mentioned, Christine will share our deck, and there's lots of different links, and you can go on our website and learn more on some of the products and services we're going to mention tonight. So I want to start off by level setting a little bit about EDC, how we help Canadian businesses, also our commitment to women and diverse owned and led businesses. I'll touch upon the exporter journey, and I'll outline some of the tools that could be relevant depending on where you are, both from a financial perspective and also knowledge perspective. And then I'll pass it over to Victoria to speak a little bit about how EDC supports within Australia. So for those of you who are not familiar with EDC, our job is to help Canadian companies do business successfully in international markets. So we are Canada's export credit agency, 100% owned by the federal government, and we really position ourselves out in the market as the international risk experts for Canadian companies. So we take that deep knowledge of international trade as well as global buyers, and that really enables us to take on and manage significant levels of risk in order to help more Canadian companies. So EDC is part of the federal family of organizations that work very much together as Team Canada. And some of our programs are shared, and we do different referrals and different initiatives together. So there's a lot of misconceptions about exporting and also about EDC. And one of the main ones is really that it's only for large companies or those making products and shipping those overseas. So in fact, EDC can actually help all companies regardless of their size as well as markets. It just depends on where they are at in their export journey. And I'll touch upon that in a moment. We also support service-based exporters and companies selling into global supply chains, and that's what we would call indirect exporters. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how EDC is approaching inclusive trade, which is how we support a more inclusive and diverse Canadian economy. So we know that the number of diverse entrepreneurs are growing, and that it could have an enormous benefit to our economy and our community. And our goal is really to support that growth and scale it globally. So now more than ever, EDC is committed to engaging and supporting underrepresented entrepreneurs in trade, including women, Indigenous, Black-owned and led businesses. We're also looking to expand our focus with the objective of better meeting the unique needs of other equity-seeking groups owned and led by other groups such as racialized Canadians, as well as those owned and led by members of the LGBTQ2+ community and or persons with disabilities. So this is how we approach inclusive trade from all audiences. So I wanted to talk a little bit about specifically our Women in Trade strategy. So the first area of focus is around inspiring and building awareness amongst diverse entrepreneurs about taking their business global and how EDC can help. We also look to focus on educating and providing the knowledge and skills so that they can then export with confidence. We look to provide connections both to the ecosystem within Canada, but also to global opportunities. And the fourth pillar is all around enabling, both from a financial and knowledge perspective. And lastly, we look to empower with our corporate support for equity, diversity, inclusion, and economic empowerment more broadly. I wanted to give a really tangible and recent example of some of the work that we do with partners. So I believe you're mostly all familiar with SheEO, and EDC actually launched last week a really exciting opportunity for companies that are looking to grow globally and expand. So this is a great example of the types of partners that we work with. And this is called the EDC SheEO Go Global Activator Cohort. And as part of this cohort, companies will be gifted an activation with SheEO, but also get access to EDC support with trade and global business. Another element of this partnership is actually a mentorship opportunity with a CITP. So that's a Certified International Trade Professional here in Canada, who would actually be paired to the cohort participants. So applications actually close next Friday, and the cohort will take part in 2022. So if you're interested, please check out the link. And if you know any other women-owned companies who are interested, please pass it on. So I wanted to talk a little bit about exporting and what the exporting journey looks like and the different resources that are available depending on where you're at. So this is what we call the exporter journey at EDC. And basically, depending on where a company is at, depending if they're just starting to do research and planning to export, or if they're new to exporting, or if they're already fairly established and are looking for growth in existing or new markets. So one of the most important steps for business in generally is all about planning. So when it comes to exporting, it's the same thing, right? So making sure that you have your corporate strategy and then building upon that your export plan, actively getting ready to export, and then managing the risks of exporting. Once you've entered those new markets, looking for those sales, and then continuing to grow those export sales. So throughout that journey, there's different needs and barriers that can come up for support. Those can include things like accessing market knowledge, making new connections, introduction to buyers, the risk of non-payment. These are just a couple of them. And wherever that company sits on the spectrum, there's different solutions available to support. So both from a financial as well as access to market knowledge, resources, or introductions to some of our partners within the ecosystem. So I wanted to speak briefly about the other solutions available with EDC and how we can help. So in the beginning, companies are often looking for knowledge. They're doing research, trying to determine what the best market entry strategy and download knowledge assets and things like that. So this is really where EDC can help. We have different contents on our website, free guides, webinars, things like that. We also have a really great service called the Export Help Hub, which essentially is a self-tool that you can go on, ask any trade-related question, and within a few business days, you'll get a response from one of our expert advisors. You can also use the search function to see the hundreds and hundreds of questions that have been asked before. One of the first financial tools we speak to companies about when they start selling outside of Canada is credit insurance. So credit insurance protects your profits and balance sheets by insuring against the risk of non-payment. It also allows you to offer more competitive payment terms. It also increases access to working capital as banks assign more lending value to foreign receivables, which are insured. So this could be an interesting tool to start as you take on new buyers. As companies grow and start to take on more contracts internationally, they often require access to additional working capital to be able to ensure that they can respond quickly to new opportunities and continue to scale. So EDC works with a company's financial institution and offers various guarantee programs so that the financial institution's risk is reduced, and therefore they're more likely to provide in confidence and access to credit to their clients. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a new program that we've launched earlier this year called the Inclusive Trade Investment Program. So we know that for Canadian exporting businesses owned and led by people of various dimensions of diversity, one of the main barriers to growth is lack of equitable access to capital. So this program helps to address that challenge and creates more opportunities for growth. This fund comes in the form of equity capital through direct investments, and companies need to have a commercial revenue growth that's accelerating towards 1 million with significant export growth potential. So I know that we've covered a lot in a short amount of time. And as I mentioned, there's several resources available from EDC. So here's a couple of the ones that I mentioned throughout the presentation. You can go check it out. I'll also put my contact information in the chat. You can connect with me, and I'll now just pass it over to Victoria, who's going to touch upon a bit her role and what we do in the EDC Australia office.
Great, thanks, Catherine. So hi everyone, my name is Victoria Searle and I'm EDC's Program Coordinator for Australia and New Zealand based in Sydney, Australia. So along with my colleague Deanne Beliveau, who is EDC's Chief Representative in Australia and New Zealand, as well as the Trade Commissioner Service based here in Australia, we support Canadian companies to grow and succeed in this region specifically. So Catherine mentioned the support and types of solutions EDC can provide, but I wanted to quickly share some of our key tips for success in the Australian market. So Australia is actually a relatively easy market for Canadian companies to do business in. We're an English-speaking nation, and we also share some cultural similarities with Canada, as touched on by Michelle previously. So EDC have actually recently published a guide to our top 5 cultural tips for doing business in Australia. And these include some information about how to build rapport by starting meetings with some small talk about general topics such as the weather and sports, staying modest, and also offering proven products and solutions. So we definitely recommend having a look at the links on the slide for further information in that regard. One thing that we often see as the key challenges for Canadian companies when they're trying to do business in Australia and New Zealand is the geographic distance and also the time difference, as referenced by Sarah previously. And so to overcome these challenges, one thing that we often recommend is that Canadian companies consider establishing a local presence by engaging an in-market representative, such as a partner or a distributor or sales agent that can assist them to do business and be successful in this region. So basically, if you have any questions or you'd like to get in touch with the Sydney office, please don't hesitate to reach out to Deanne and myself, as we would be really happy to hear from you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Victoria, and Catherine as well. Now we have Jessica Horowitz, partner at Bennett Jones LLP, law firm in Toronto, to talk about the legal issues you should be aware of when exporting from Canada to international markets, such as those of Australia and New Zealand. Jessica, we're really grateful for you to come on board today to help us out. We're very, the Asia Pacific Foundation has great ties with Bennett Jones, and so we're very, very grateful for you. Thank you very much, Jessica. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you for inviting me to participate. This is a fantastic initiative, and I'm really glad to see that there's been such good uptake and participation, which I think just goes to show the opportunities that are available in Australia and New Zealand and in international trade generally. So let's see if I can share my screen without taking myself out of this presentation. All right, let's see if we can, do this. Are you able to see my slides? Okay, perfect. So it has fallen to me to give you the whirlwind tour of everything you need to know in the law to trade internationally in 10 minutes. So let's get started. And because we are going to be covering a lot of ground, I have a number of slides to get through, some of which are quite dense, but I'm going to be sort of flying through them and not necessarily covering all of the points on each slide, but I will make sure that I send a copy of these in so that they can be circulated afterwards. And of course, my contact information is at the end, and you can always contact me for any questions. So, and also before we get started, I'll just note that I am also located in Toronto, and as Christine mentioned, I'll acknowledge that it's the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples, and a number of other nations and First Nations and Métis peoples. So I'll start with commercial considerations. So I'm the lawyer, so I'm talking from the perspective of how do we get this deal done? How do we, what are the next steps? So this obviously would come after the initial scoping and exploratory considerations that some of the other speakers have mentioned, such as evaluating the viability of the market competition, research, that kind of thing. So you've looked at the market, you think it's a good idea for me to expand my business there. And so what do? So the first thing that you want to think about is the commercial structuring of your sales. So is there a need for you to have a local presence in the local market? There may be, there may not be. If it is possible to do direct sales, for example, if you're running an e-commerce company and you can make sales online and ship via courier, for example, to customers, there might not be a need for you to establish operations in the destination country, which would make things a lot easier from a legal and logistical and risk perspective. However, if you're entering the market in a more serious way, or you're providing a service or a product that needs local support, local warehousing, local distribution, then you have to consider about how you're going to enter. So I won't cover the ground that everyone else has mentioned, but there's lots of different ways to do this. You can have non-resident operations in the foreign country, so without, for example, necessarily incorporating a local subsidiary. You can have an incorporation of a local subsidiary, which basically makes you you'd be setting up essentially a resident or a permanent establishment business in the jurisdiction, which carries tax implications and other legal implications. Partnering with a local distributor, if there is one, is always a great option, because that can you can partner with somebody who has insight into the local market and also might be willing to take on some of the local regulatory risks so that you don't have to become an expert in foreign law. Joint ventures is another structure, and that's required in some jurisdictions, not in Australia or New Zealand, but there are some countries, for example, a lot of Middle Eastern countries, that require you to have a local partner. Also at the evaluation stage, before you go too far, you want to make sure that you're protecting your interests. So if you're in negotiations with a potential business partner, think about whether you need to be entering into an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. If you're going to be sharing any kind of sensitive information or trade secrets with your potential partner. Think about intellectual property protection. So, you know, if your business is in large part dependent on your brand recognition or patents, you want to get some local legal advice about what steps you need to take to register that intellectual property in the local jurisdiction to make sure that that nobody steals your intellectual property before you can lay a claim to it. Think about regulatory considerations in the destination market with reference to what your product is. So can I even sell my product or service there? Is it, you know, for something that's innocuous, this may not be a big issue, but if it's, you know, something like a controlled substance or maybe a dangerous product or a chemical product that is, you know, subject to local regulation, it's something that you need to think about before you get too far, just so that you can identify those potential barriers and address them. When you enter into an agreement, so you've now decided the structure by which you're going to enter the market, you have to think about what kind of contracts should I have in place with my counterparties or business partners. If you're selling directly to customers, then this might be as simple as, you know, terms and conditions of sale or sale agreements. If you're entering into a joint venture or distribution partnership, a longer term arrangement, you're probably going to want to have something more formal to document that relationship. In certain relationships, something a non-binding agreement could be sufficient. So something like a memorandum of understanding, a letter of intent, term sheets. So really, it depends on what the level of risk is. You know, how much are you investing? How much you are relying on the counterparty will determine how detailed your legal agreements need to be. So I'm the lawyer who's telling you, you don't always need a very detailed legal agreement, which might be surprising, but everything should be right-sized for, you know, what you're trying to accomplish. Think about the key terms in your contracts. I won't go through all the, you know, we could do a whole session on contracts and terms, but things to think about: the governing law. Is it Canadian law? Is it Australian law? Is it New Zealand law? Where, you know, if there's a dispute resolution, where do you have to sue the person? Think about whose form the contract is in, whether you're drafting it or they're drafting it, and who because the person who drafts the first version often gets to set a lot of the major sort of boilerplate clauses that can actually be quite important. Think about whether there's requirements for insurance, whether you want indemnities. And then also think about some of the practical things, like if you're shipping goods, are you negotiating Incoterms? You know, what are the terms of delivery going to be? Who's going to take on the liability and the insurance for international shipping, which can be a pretty substantial undertaking, especially if you're shipping such a distance as between Canada and Australia and New Zealand. So customs and trade considerations. So I'm a trade lawyer. I'm sorry, I neglected to introduce myself at the beginning of the presentation, but I'm a partner in the International Trade Group at Bennett Jones. So the section that I just presented, I'm a little bit of a poser there, because I'm not a corporate commercial lawyer. I've just absorbed enough from my colleagues to be able to give a 2-minute presentation on it. But this is really my area. So the trade group, we specialize in customs laws, free trade agreements, export controls, economic sanctions, anti-corruption. So basically all of these sort of regulatory issues related to cross-border trade in goods and services. So you always have to remember when you're exporting that there's two sides to international trade. There's how do I get goods out of Canada? And then there's how do I get the goods into the destination country? And those are often completely separate areas of law. So for example, I wouldn't tell you that I could advise on Australia or New Zealand law. I'm a Canadian lawyer. The first thing that I would tell you, if you came to me and you said I'm exporting to Australia and I want to set up a branch operation there, I'd say that's great. Let's get local Australian counsel. So make sure that you have the right legal counsel in all the right jurisdictions to make sure that you're covered. And then think also about residual liability. So for example, you might, depending on how you decide to enter the market, even if you're, for example, direct selling and you're just an exporter from Canada and you're not setting up operations in the foreign country, there could, under local laws, be residual liability. For example, if you have a situation where a product is defective and causes injury to a customer, or there's a recall, there are some legal regimes where that liability can flow back up the chain to the manufacturer. So that's something to think about. This slide is just about different ways to structure exporting of services. I've been sort of focusing on goods, but I think as one of the other speakers pointed out, the services are actually representing a large proportion of the trade between Canada and New Zealand and Australia. So there are different ways that services can be provided internationally. It doesn't always entail the travel of people across borders, especially in today's digital economy. You can often provide services without ever leaving Canada, and the consumer of the services would be in Australia or New Zealand. And then similarly, you can, a tourist from Australia or New Zealand that travels to Canada and stays in a Canadian hotel, that's technically an export of services, because you have foreign money coming into Canada in exchange for a service. So you can think a little bit more broadly about services exports. Customs duties, taxes, and non-tariff barriers. So again, we could do a whole session on customs rules, but I'm just going to flag these basic principles for you, and I won't explain them in detail. I'm just going to flag their existence, and we can go into more detail in the Q&A. But when you're considering, so I'm talking about trading goods now, services are not subject to duties. They might be subject to local taxes, but they wouldn't be subject to duties. So goods are subject to duties. The rate of duty is assessed based on the tariff classification of the goods and the origin of the goods. So the tariff classification, there is an international system. It's called the Harmonized System of Tariff Classification, established by the World Customs Organization, that prescribes how importers and exporters classify the products that they're trading. So how do you tell a customs authority what is in this box? And you've got a series of 10-digit codes that tell them what's in the box. The importer's responsibility is to classify those goods correctly. So if you are declaring something under the wrong tariff classification and paying the wrong rate of duty, for example, on those goods, that's on you as the importer of record. You're liable for that. Same thing with origin. You have to declare the accurate origin of the goods, and that is not just where the goods are shipped from. That is not the origin of the goods for customs purpose. The origin of the goods for customs purposes is where does the good originate under the applicable rule of origin. And this is a very complicated area. The CPTPP has been mentioned a few times, and free trade agreements are always in the negotiations. The hairiest part of the negotiations is always negotiating the rules of origin, because it goes into questions of how much value added content do you need to have in a particular country for it to originate there. If you have, if you're manufacturing something in Canada from imported components and you put it all together in Canada, package it up, ship it to Australia, is that assembly that you did in Canada sufficient to confer Canadian origin on the product for purposes of Australian tariffs or the CPTPP, if you want to claim that? So very important question, not an easy answer, and don't assume that you necessarily know the answer if you've, unless you've looked into it. Excuse me. Okay, customs valuation, excuse me, also very important, because duties are often, excuse me, This is what happens when I try to cover all the laws in 10 minutes. Yeah, value is important because duties are often assessed on an ad valorem basis, which means as a percentage of the value of the good. And then we talked about non-tariff barriers, looking into regulatory standards, whether you need any kind of certifications for the product that you're selling, whether there's different packaging and labeling requirements in the local market. These are all things you have to think about. The CPTPP has been mentioned a number of times. I won't go into detail, but suffice it to say that it's a free trade agreement. Excuse me. It also includes a number of investment protection mechanisms, and it includes regulatory harmonization undertakings, and also other protections of things like labor and the environment, commitments by the parties to establish minimum standards in these areas. So it's a great thing, and it definitely facilitates trade with these countries. Here's a little slide showing the partner countries of the CPTPP. Now, it's not in force yet with respect to Brunei, Chile, Malaysia, or Peru, because those countries haven't yet ratified the agreement. They haven't implemented their domestic laws, but it's coming. And Canada, of course, has other free trade agreements with Peru and Chile. E-commerce and digital trade. There are provisions in the CPTPP to facilitate that, and barriers to digital commerce are lowering slowly, but there are still a lot of barriers to think about, such as consumer protection laws, cybersecurity restrictions and considerations, and also privacy laws. Also, I've noticed that there's a number of participants here that are in the healthcare sector. Excuse me, I need the healthcare sector. Sorry, the healthcare sector is a sector that is subject to a lot of privacy protections and restrictions on international flows of data. So, for example, healthcare data is a particularly sensitive and protected area of information, and there are in many jurisdictions restrictions on how and when you can transfer that information out of Canada or across borders. So that's something really important to think about, especially if you're in a healthcare technology service business. I don't think we have time to go into a detailed discussion of rules of origin, but I think I covered that. In general, this was the harmonized system, the 10-digit codes. We won't go into detail. I will mention on exporting, one of the things that you have to think about as an exporter is about export controls. So is the product that you're exporting a sensitive category of technology that requires an export permit from Global Affairs? Or is it a product that is subject to certain certification requirements like phytosanitary certificates for food? If you're exporting food, you need a certificate from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, for example. So it's really important to think about what your products are and to do that due diligence to figure out exactly what kind of authorizations are needed, not only on the Canadian export side, but also in the import side, because, I can't tell you how many times we've had clients coming to us with a shipping container at a Canadian port that's been detained by customs because their shipment of food doesn't have the proper sanitary certificate from the exporting country. So it can cause real problems if you don't have that all set up before you actually send your shipment. Exports do need to be reported from Canada, but not in all circumstances. So it's important to look, it'll depend on the value of the goods, the destination of the goods, whether it's a restricted category of goods, and so on. Economic sanctions. So this can basically be boiled down to counterparty due diligence. So when you're trading internationally, it's really important to remember that Canada and other countries have restrictions on individuals and entities in certain locations, and also on certain countries or certain regions, on Canadians' ability to trade there. So it's very, very important before you enter a new market to look at whether there are any sanctions restrictions or other restrictions on trading under Canada's under Canadian laws, or under the laws of other jurisdictions that might be relevant to you. For example, if you do a lot of business in the United States, or if you have US bank accounts and US operations, you might want to think about evaluating your compliance obligations with US law, or voluntarily complying, because sometimes, even if you're not subject to law for reasons of commercial, giving comfort to your counterparties, it might be desirable to comply with other countries' laws as well. Corruption and bribery. I would hope that this is less of a risk in jurisdictions like Australia and New Zealand, although I always tell people that don't forget about domestic bribery in Canada as well, because we're not so squeaky clean here, for anybody who's read about, the construction industry in Montreal, for example. So it's always important, especially if you're in a sector that's doing any kind of government contracting, to make sure that you have screening systems and financial controls in place to make sure that there are no improper payments or benefits being offered to any public officials in the foreign jurisdiction. I mentioned already data localization rules and privacy laws, really, really important to think about if you're in a tech sector. You might also need to think about foreign employment laws, for example, if you're thinking of employing local sales agents. And then this also might pull in income tax laws, because if you're sending, for example, Canadian sales reps to Australia, depending on how much time they're spending there and what they're doing there, they might become subject to Australian income tax as well and create an establishment there. So something to think about. Okay, so just to sum up, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Do your due diligence beforehand. Due diligence, that's lawyers' favorite phrase. Know the product, know the destination, know your partners. And then have a compliance system and policies that are the right size for your business. You don't have to have a Cadillac, international best gold standard compliance program and policy in all cases. You just have to do something that's really going to target your specific risks and address them and mitigate them. If you find a problem, don't look the other way, address it. And that's it. I probably took more time than I was allotted, but I hope you'll permit me, Christine.
No, that was really, I know the stuff on the regulatory stuff, the legislative stuff is always so important. And I know we didn't have enough time tonight, but really you did cover just about everything in that short time that you were allotted. So thank you very much. And again, we hope that you'll be able to share the slides with us so we can distribute to the delegates. Thank you very, very much. I should mention at this point that one of our contractors on the ground, Tanya Te Fenua, who's leading on the arranging the B2Bs in New Zealand for our delegates, is offering to arrange a session to address legal issues of importing into New Zealand. Now, you just spoke about the, Jessica just spoke about the exporting out of Canada rules. Now, we're going to have a session. This will take place after the official program, the mission itself. But just to let you know that Tanya and her team will be reaching out to you to set this up perhaps in the week after the actual mission. So please be aware. Now we have one more presentation up before the Q&A. I know we're running out of time, we're behind the time, but I'm going to ask my colleague, A.W. Lee, to talk about the Canadian Women's International Network, or CanWIN, which we established in earlier in the spring. And our team's been working to get the back end of the portal ready for members' usage shortly, hopefully. And we intend to onboard all of you And we're working to invite delegates from all previous and future missions to join this CanWin network. AW, who is our senior program manager responsible for delivering the Women's Mission Project, will update you on the portal and advise you on the onboarding. So AW, over to you. AW.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button. And yeah, so just to show everyone all the hard work that's gone into this, the CanWin portal. We announced this formalization of this network earlier this year, and it's really a culmination of Christine's vision and the efforts of our team at APF Canada to connect women and non-binary entrepreneurs like yourselves to global markets. And our first steps with this mission are these trade missions and delegations like yours, but we're now at the stage where we want to formally connect all of you with not just each other, but also our past delegates, other women leaders in business, and your supporters in government who want to see you succeed. And so the two key ingredients, like that's been hammered home by all of the presenters to this export success, is access to people, experts like all the folks on this call, but as well as information about the markets you're accessing. So we've taken the last few months to develop an online platform that will host both of these functions. So first, a network where you can connect with like-minded women and non-binary folks in business and government who can further connect you to export support resources, as well as a whole host of Asia-focused learning materials. So first, on the network, you'll be able to see your peers, other entrepreneurs, other CanWin champions like Christine, who are open to mentoring and providing guidance, pointing you in the right direction to access the kinds of supports on your export journey. And we're also really inspired by the SheEO model of ask and give. So asking for help and advice from your CanWin colleagues and providing that same advice to other women entrepreneurs when asked for. And so we'll have a dedicated Slack workspace where you can connect, and you'll also be able to read more about each other on the platform itself in those profiles like the one that I just flashed on screen. And the second part of the platform is all about learning. So learning about the new markets is key to entering those markets. And so we've had the pleasure of, over the years, of working with organizations like EDC, like the Trade Commissioner Service, and other in-market experts, just like the trade offices in New Zealand and Australia, in Taiwan, in South Korea, and Japan, just like tonight. And it's on this platform where we'll be aggregating a number of these videos to give you similar insights into Asia-Pacific markets. But along with that, you'll see, so that'll be under the training resources, but along with that, we'll have an Asia intelligence dashboard and business mission maps, where our team has pulled together market intelligence about potential competitors, product substitutes, but also potential partners and complementary services and companies that you might be able to partner with as distributors, etc. But also so here is one of the location maps in Taiwan, where it showcases the innovation ecosystem with potential partners, but also the dashboard of market intelligence aggregates macroeconomic indicators of 24 Asian economies into this interactive user tool where you'll be able to learn about these markets. It pulls together indicators like average tariffs, not important for CPTPP member jurisdictions, but also other GDP growth scores, economic openness scores, projected consumer growth rate scores, but also consumer age distributions for those in markets that are concerned about age distribution and age segmentation. So all of this information we hope will help you when assessing where in Asia you want to take your business next. And because we also have a focus on women's advancement, we've also added gender inequality indices to the economic dashboard to add that extra layer of social information. So as delegates, we'll be inviting you to be some of our first beta testers of the platform. And after signing up, you'll be able to use the tools, connect with each other, continue to connect with each other. And as we invite more members from our past delegations, from our networks, and other women entrepreneurs and their supporters, you'll see the network grow. So be on the lookout for that from us. So Christine?
Okay. Thank you very much for that whirlwind explanation of the thing, of the CanWin. But we invite all of you to join, because I think down the road you'll find it very interesting. And the main thing is it's a public good that the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada is offering to you. It's free. Once you join and you're registered with us, you can get all that information and network with all the women. And a lot of them are from overseas, from our jurisdictions that we target for our missions, and useful information overall, I think. So anyway, we are now we've got a very short period of time to go into the Q&As. So I ask people to put some questions in if you don't, in the Q&A, in the chat. But I'm going to start off with a couple of questions here, I think. We covered a lot of territory here, but I think what I'd like to ask are either Matt. I think if Matt's still online with us, is he? In New Zealand.
Yes, I'm still online.
Matt, you know, New Zealand just finished hosting this year's APEC meetings, right? And
yes, yeah.
part of its focus as host was to bring greater recognition of Indigenous peoples, economies, and perspectives to post-COVID recovery. So what forms does recognition of Indigenous peoples, economies, and perspectives take in business cultures and practices in each of, let's say, Australia and New Zealand? I'll ask you to address the New Zealand part, and maybe we'll go to Michelle on the Australia, or Sarah Quigley if either or can pipe in.
Christine, could you just repeat the last part of that question? So the recognition of...
What forms does a recognition of Indigenous peoples, economies, and perspectives take in business cultures and practices?
In the business culture, right. So in New Zealand, it's fairly well integrated, I would say. And so, you know, I mentioned right at the start of the presentation, we have, you know, Western business culture and Maori business culture, but in the bigger organizations, more mature organizations, it's kind of one and the same. So when I think of like one of our big dairy industry companies, say Fonterra, big dairy manufacturing company, Maori business culture is just part of the way they do business. So they'll have their own waiata, their own songs, their own hakas. You know, yeah. So the big mature companies, well integrated. The smaller companies that might not have as much resources, less so. But there is always that there's always that acknowledgement within New Zealand. Maori business in its own right is a big, like you'll be learning next week, no doubt, in its own right is a force to be reckoned with. They have a large asset base and well run in multiple sectors, and always looking for export opportunities. So you'll see that, and yeah, therefore Yeah, I would say well integrated is probably my answer to that, and yeah, you'll see it.
Yeah.
You'll absolutely see it next week.
That's what we thought. But so
Yeah.
I'm not surprised. Thank you for that. Sarah or Michelle, do either of you want to pop in on the Australian side? Did we lose Sarah? Oh.
No, you got me here. I'm happy to say that the small piece of the puzzle that I've worked on, look, Indigenous business in Australia is not as coordinated as compared with New Zealand, just due to sheer number of groups and languages. Like, it's just a numbers game. That being said, there is enormous growing funds and programs by the Australian government at a federal level and at the state levels to increase success rates of Indigenous businesses. They face large financial hurdles that traditional businesses don't always. And perhaps I should call Indigenous businesses the traditional businesses. They've been trading a long time before other businesses. But there's not always the access to finance and intergenerational wealth that you find outside of Indigenous businesses or with non-Indigenous business. And not a lot of the Indigenous businesses, and I would say this for Canadians and Australians, it's a small percentage that are exporting. In Canada, if you'd exclude exports to the United States, there's an even smaller number. So obviously, massive goal of ours would be to hugely increase that and facilitate that. And how do we do that? And one of the small ways we've found has been helpful recently is sort of connecting people. So creating an infrastructure from a bridge from Canadian Indigenous business to Australian, and not just Australian Indigenous business, but to like supplier diversity groups. So one of the organizations that Austrade and myself work with is Supply Nation, and they've been critical, as have other Indigenous chambers of commerce like Kinaway in Victoria and I've got more examples. And they just want to create these cultural and business exchanges, and then they create this infrastructure where they're helping each other out. I think there's many more available opportunities through EDC and TCS and other organizations, but it's not always straightforward for Indigenous business to access those traditional source of support and funding. So it's just about broadening awareness and making more connections. And that's on all of us to keep networking, like what AW just referred to, the new Can Win network. Like that's another tool in the toolkit that's going to help facilitate this.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Michelle, do you have anything to add?
I don't think so. That was very well said.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I think we're at a close, coming to a close here. I am really apologize for the tight time frame that we were working under tonight, but I'd like to take this opportunity really to thank all the speakers for taking time out of their busy schedules, and some of them with very short notice, to join us this evening. And to the delegates, thanks for your attention tonight, and hope that you found the session useful. We promise to send out all the slides that were shared this evening to you, along with the updated agenda. And if there's anything, I believe that all the video pitches are now into us. They all look great. So thank you very much for the hard work that you put into those video pitches. I'm sure they'll serve you well in the pitch session during the mission next week. And if there's nothing else to add here, and there's no more questions, I'd like to say good night. Merci beaucoup pour votre attention ce soir. Kia ora koto kata. So thank you very much, everyone, and take care and have a good night.